Everybody. I'm Michael Rugel, pleased to be joined here today by Maurice Samuels, author of Alfred Dreyfus, the man at the center of the man at the center of the affair. I am the director of programs and content here at the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, where we tell the stories of Jews serving in the American military from before the Revolution up to the present. Today we divert just slightly as we get away from the United States to discuss a Jew in the French military. But it's not much of a diversion, as the Dreyfus affair impacted so much of the world, including the U.S. We talk a lot here about the formation of the first Jewish Veterans Association in the U.S., the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, which was in 1896. And we often frame that as a response to American anti-Semitism and as a response to the idea that gets repeated frequently in that time that Jews didn't fight in the Civil War. But we probably should talk a little more about the impact of the Dreyfus affair, how much it impacted this era, how much it's impacted thinking about Jews and the military. And Maury's book was a pleasure to really read. It's incredibly relevant both for our time and for the work we do here. It's not only a look at how anti-Semitism can divide a society, it's the story of an individual who's a soldier and a Jew. We will get to the program just a second. I'd like to remind people we will get the Q&A at the beginning, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and you can start doing that at any time, and we will get to the questions at the end. Maurice Samuels is the Betty Jane Alien Professor of French at Yale University, where he also chairs the French department and directs the Yale Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism. A recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Coleman Center Fellowship at the New York Public Library. He's the author of 5 books, including The Betrayal of the Duchess, published in 2020, and most recently, Alfred Dreyfus, The Man at the Center of the Affair, which was published in February in the Jewish Life series at Yale University Press. I should mention that the Jewish Life series is a great series for everyone out there. They got a lot of different volumes that are both readable, have the academic weight of the academic thought without being burdened down in academic writing. And I really recommend that whole series to everyone, and please do go out and buy Alfred Dreyfus, The Man at the Center of the Affair. Maury, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for turning out on this hot day, probably hot wherever you are. Okay, so in 1894, a Jewish officer in the French army named Alfred Dreyfus was accused of selling military secrets to Germany. Tried and found guilty based on trumped-up evidence in a hasty court-martial, he was shipped off to Devil's Island, a remote penal colony off the coast of South America, and began serving a life sentence under unbelievably brutal conditions. Meanwhile, back in France, his devoted wife and brother launched a campaign to prove his innocence that wound up dividing the French nation and riveting the world. The Dreyfus affair, as the case came to be known, plunged France into crisis because it raised fundamental questions about the nature of liberal democracy, the form of government that guaranteed rights to the individual through the rule of law. It raised these questions at a moment when liberal values were triumphing throughout much of the world, but also when the seeds of anti-liberalism were being planted in many of the same nations that had pioneered political freedom. On its face, the affair asked whether individual citizens could claim the right to impartial justice, even when this right conflicted with military or national interest. On a deeper level, it asked whether religious and racial minorities belonged in the nation at all. Scholars have thoroughly explored the ins and outs of Dreyfus's legal case, as well as dozens of other topics related to the affair. They've also shown how it widened divisions between the left and the right in France, led to the separation of church and state, witnessed the first interventions by intellectuals in political matters, and even changed social and gender relations in lasting ways. Surprisingly, though, the Jewish dimension of the affair has received relatively little attention. I'm not saying that it's received. No, everyone mentions that Dreyfus is Jewish, of course, but it's rarely been the focus of study. This hesitation dates, I think, to the early days of the affair itself, when Dreyfus's family and other supporters, many of them Jews, sought to broaden their coalition by emphasizing the universal values at the core of the case: truth, justice, the rule of law, etc., rather than the supposedly narrow issue of anti-Semitism. They also wanted to avoid seeming to support Dreyfus merely out of sectarian impulses, and to give the lie to accusations by anti Semites that Dreyfus was being defended by a powerful Jewish syndicate. Ever since, scholars, especially in France, have shared this tendency to universalize the affair. Most scholars treat the issue of anti Semitism only tangentially, and some go as far as to deny its importance to the case. In contrast, my recently published biography of Dreyfus argues that his Jewishness was central to every aspect of the case, from why he was accused to why the case became an affair. And in my talk today, I'll lay out my reasoning, focusing primarily on the issue of anti Semitism. I'll conclude by examining the effect that the Dreyfus affair had on Jews around the world, showing how it laid the groundwork for the emergence of a modern form of Jewish identity conceived in response to anti Semitism. And I'll reflect on some of the lessons that the affair has for our current moment. So, first, some background on Dreyfus himself and on the affair that bears his name. And if we go to the first slide, Mike. So Alfred Dreyfus, let's go to the first slide after that. Alfred Dreyfus was born in 1859 in Mulhouse in the French province of Alsace, near the border with Switzerland, right on the eastern edge of France. Thanks to the French Revolution, when France became the first European nation to grant Jews full civil rights in 1790 and 91, French Jews had become the best integrated Jews in the world in the middle of the 19th century. And the rise of the Dreyfus family typifies this success. Alfred's father, Raphael, and if we go to the next slide, started out as a peddler of cloth in Mulhouse, which was a capital of textile manufacturing. And in the 1860s, he took advantage of the disruption in the cotton trade caused by the American Civil War to launch his own factory. Within a few years, he had become a wealthy industrialist. Alfred and his 6 siblings were raised in a mansion with servants in the center of town. Whereas many residents of Alsace spoke German and most of the Jews spoke Yiddish, the Protestant elite of Mulhouse was mainly Francophone, and Raphael decided to raise his 2 youngest children, Mathieu and Alfred, in French. They attended French schools and became ardent French patriots. Alfred's happy childhood came to an end with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when Prussian troops occupied Mulhouse. France would be forced to cede the eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to a newly unified Germany, nourishing a militaristic cult of revenge in France that lasted until World War I, when France, of course, finally regained those lost provinces. So, like many Alsatian Jews, the Dreyfuses opted for French citizenship in 1870, although Alfred's oldest brother, Jacques, became German in order to hold on to the family's textile mills in Mulhouse. Alfred and his brother Mathieu were sent to boarding school in Paris, and Alfred eventually decided to pursue a career in the French military. Now, this was not an unusual choice for a young Alsatian Jew. Unlike in Germany, where there were no Jewish officers until World War I, the French army, in its attempt to modernize after its stinging loss in the Franco-Prussian War, became largely meritocratic and open to Jews. By the end of the 19th century, France had roughly 300 Jewish officers. Dreyfus won admission to the École Polytechnique, which was then and now at the very pinnacle of the French university system and was a training ground for the officer corps. Although Jews represented only 0.2% of the French population, so about 80,000 out of 40 million, They made up 3 to 4% of the École Polytechnique in those years. Upon graduation in 1880, Dreyfus joined the army and began his rise through the ranks, eventually securing a coveted position on the Army's general staff. He was an intern on the general staff, which the Army referred to as the Holy of Holies. In 1890, the up-and-coming officer married Lucie Adamar, and if we go to the next slide, from an even more integrated French-Jewish family. Now, in the book, I use the term integrated rather than assimilated to refer to the way that the Dreyfus and Adamar families adapted themselves to French culture. This represents a departure from the way a previous generation of scholars, including most notably Hannah Arendt, referred to 19th century French Jews. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt accuses French Jews, including Dreyfus, of leaving behind their Jewish affiliation and sense of solidarity with other Jews in the rush to become French. But this was not actually the case. So Dreyfus himself was not a personally religious person, but Lucie was, and the family was moderately observant. They were nominally Orthodox, like all French Jews. The Reform movement never took hold in France, and they attended synagogue on major holidays and on the anniversaries of the death of family members. The Jewish Museum in Paris contains numerous religious artifacts that were preserved by the Dreyfus family, including Lucie's Hebrew prayer book, for example. And if we go to the next slide, Mike, I think the one before that, no, back. Yeah, there it is. Thank you. So that's Lucie's prayer book, and you see on the title page, she had recorded the death dates of different family members by the Hebrew and Gregorian calendars in order to say Kaddish. Lucie and Alfred were married in the main synagogue, in the Grand Synagogue in Paris, by Zadok Khan, France's chief rabbi, who was a friend of the family. All of Alfred's siblings married Jews, as did both of his children. So by no means did he abandon what we would call today his Jewish identity, even as he became a French military officer. It's important to note that the very specific form of Jewish identity that took shape over the course of the 19th century in France, so-called Franco-Judaism, did not view the process of becoming French as a zero-sum game for Jews. Indeed, for the generation of Jews who integrated into French culture in the 19th century, Frenchness and Jewishness went hand in hand. And that's because the France that Dreyfus and others like him loved and yearned to be a part of was the France of the Revolution, the France that had declared its fidelity to universalist values by granting the Jews and other minorities full civil rights. As Jews, they felt doubly French, since it was their emancipation that had helped define the new kind of nation that France had become. Now, this model of the nation, this universalist model, was called into question by the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism that began in France in the 1880s. France has always posed a kind of conundrum for scholars of anti-Semitism, that the European country that showed the most openness to Jews was also the country where the new racist form of anti-Semitism really took shape. However, what seems like a paradox is not one, since modern anti-Semitism developed in direct reaction to that openness. It was the new visibility of Jews in high-profile arenas in France, in business, the arts, and especially the Republican state apparatus, including the military, in the late 19th century that made them targets both for nationalists on the right and for a certain strain of socialists on the left. By the 1880s, France was increasingly divided between two competing visions of its past and its future. One was progress-oriented. It welcomed the changes brought about by the French Revolution, the political, economic, and social liberalism that had triumphed by the end of the 19th century. The other was disgruntled and nostalgic. Some in this anti modern camp yearned for a return to the old feudal order and for a society rooted in conservative religious, which is to say, Catholic values. This reactionary faction found adherents principally among the segments of society that had been left behind by modern capitalism: impoverished aristocrats, fundamentalist Catholics, insecure shopkeepers, and some segments of the rural peasantry. By the 1880s, this second group increasingly expressed its frustration with modernity through anti Semitism. Now, one of the first to sense the potential of anti Semitism to galvanize the disaffected segments of French society was the journalist Edouard Drumont. And if we go to the next slide, he published a 1,000-page screed titled La France Juive, Jewish France, in 1886. His book blamed Jews for all the evils of the modern world, and it became a runaway bestseller. Hitler would later take it as a model. Capitalizing on his success, Drumont launched a daily anti-Semitic newspaper in 1892. And if we go to the next slide, you see there it is, which devoted itself to denouncing the role of Jews in all arenas of French national life. Aided by illustrations, it perfected the kind of racialized caricature of the greedy, rapacious Jew that would become a staple in later Nazi propaganda, as in this image where, on its front cover, where a grotesque Jewish figure is shown clutching a globe. The caption reads, "Their homeland," the implication being that Jews are too cosmopolitan to really ever be French. One of Drumont's favorite targets was the presence of Jews in the French military, which his newspaper denounced in a scathing series of articles in 1892 that accused all Jews of being potential traitors. So Jews couldn't really win. They were denounced as being too cosmopolitan to be French, but then by the time, if they wanted to be in the military, they were seen as potential traitors. It therefore came as no surprise. So Drumont had launched that series of articles in 1892. It therefore came as no surprise that when in late 1894, the French military discovered that there was a traitor in its midst, suspicion fell on Dreyfus, a Jew. Was anti-Semitism the only reason that Dreyfus was suspected? Not exactly. But as I'll argue, it was the critical reason. Dreyfus had experienced relatively little anti-Semitism during his training period in the military. There was one incident when he was in officer training school when one of his teachers, who had declared openly that he hated Jews, gave Dreyfus a nearly perfect score for technical accomplishment and a 0 for the more subjective character assessment. And the other Jewish student, the only other Jewish student in the class, received a similar low mark. Dreyfus lodged a formal complaint with the head of the school and was told that it would not affect his overall standing, which entitled him to a coveted spot as an intern on the Army's general staff. So he let the matter drop. So the first, I forget how many it is, like 12 people who graduated in the top 12 automatically got this internship. And Dreyfus dropped from maybe like 4 to 8 or 9 because of the bad grade, but it didn't affect that. So he let the matter drop. However, if anti-Semitism was not a major force in the army as a whole, it did make itself felt on the general staff, the Holy of Holies, where Dreyfus was the only Jew at the time and where he was disliked by many of his superiors. At his trial, they would cite various reasons for their antipathy. His reserved manner inspired distrust, and his large fortune inspired envy. But anti-Semitism was clearly also at work. In the 1880s and 90s, the Army's top leadership was divided between an old guard that remained attached to aristocratic tradition and an up and coming group of modernizers who sought a technocratic overhaul of the Army's leadership and operations. And although not all the modernizers were Jews, all the Jews, including Dreyfus, were modernizers. Whether Dreyfus was hated by his superiors on the general staff because he was a Jew or because he was a modernizer, it seems clear that without powerful protectors, family connections, or the leadership qualities valued by the traditionalists, Dreyfus would have been denied, probably been denied a permanent position on the general staff, despite his technical brilliance, even had he never been charged with treason. Some of his superiors were clearly determined to block his path. But does that mean he was accused of treason because he was Jewish? This is one of the central questions of the affair, and it's given rise to a great deal of debate among historians. Of course, we can never know the real motivations of Dreyfus's accusers with certainty, but the events leading up to his arrest suggest that Dreyfus's Jewishness played a major role in the case. These events began with the discovery of the document known as the Bordereau. And if we go to the next slide, in late September 1894, which was intercepted by French counterintelligence and indicated that someone in the French army was selling secrets to the Germans. The information offered in the Bordereau was not terribly important, and the discovery might not have turned into an affair had General Auguste Mercier, and if we go to the next slide, not taken an interest in the case. A graduate of the École Polytechnique, Mercier was considered a modernizer, and his appointment as Minister of War in May 1894 had angered the nationalist far right. Drummond repeatedly attacked him in the pages of La Libre Parole, his anti-Semitic newspaper, for being allied with Jews. Mercier believed that by catching the spy, he could prove his worthiness to the nationalist right, and he therefore put pressure on his underlings to unmask the Bordereau's author as quickly as possible. Soon, the French counterintelligence office developed a theory, later shown to be erroneous, that the spy had to be an intern on the general staff because only someone who moved between divisions would have had access to the disparate types of information contained in the document. Furthermore, they reasoned also erroneously that given the nature of the information on munitions, the spy was probably an artillery officer. They looked at the list of artillery officers among the interns on the general staff, and one name stood out, Dreyfus, the only Jewish name on that list. On October 6th, two of the top generals compared the handwriting of the Bordereau to that of Dreyfus and believed it matched. Similarities did, in fact, exist. However, there were also major differences, and the expert graphologists who testified at Dreyfus's trial were actually divided in their conclusions. One of them, the eccentric Alphonse Bertillon, well known for his use of photography to identify and classify criminals, advanced the theory that Dreyfus had attempted to disguise his own handwriting in the Bordereau. This was the outlandish self-forgery hypothesis. That the counter-espionage officers were willing to entertain such a ridiculous theory suggests that they were swayed by anti-Semitism rather than by the facts of the case. It seems clear to me that while the military brass did not consider Dreyfus guilty only because he was Jewish, the fact that he was Jewish led them to accept his guilt more easily. In other words, because Dreyfus was a Jew, the officers investigating the case were not surprised that he would have committed treason once they realized that he was a military officer on the general staff and saw the superficial similarity between his handwriting and that of the Bordereau. Indeed, as soon as the colonel in charge of counter-espionage, Sonder, a known anti-Semite, was informed that Dreyfus was the suspect, he declared, "I should have known." Was anti-Semitism also at play at Dreyfus's brief court-martial in December 1894, where the military judges were shown a secret file with supposedly damning evidence that was kept hidden from Dreyfus's lawyers in clear violation of the law? Once again, the court seems to have been very willing to violate legal procedure and to believe the hypothesis of Dreyfus's guilt based on very flimsy evidence. Dreyfus was found guilty by the court martial and subjected to a humiliating public degradation spectacle. If we go to the next slide, in the courtyard of the École Militaire, so right near the Eiffel Tower, where his insignia were stripped from his uniform and his sword was broken, as a crowd of 10,000 screamed, "Death to the traitor, death to Judas." It's hard to imagine how painful this ceremony must have been for Dreyfus, who only ever longed to serve the French nation and who now had been found guilty of betraying it. And if we go to the next slide, that's the mugshot taken right after the ceremony. Dreyfus's sister protested in a letter to the government that her brother's only crime was having been born a Jew. Dreyfus himself supposedly made a comment to that effect to the prison warden after his arrest. However, his early supporters were reluctant to emphasize the role played by anti Semitism in the case. Their goal was to get as many people as possible to believe in his innocence, and they thought that emphasizing universal values like truth and justice were the way to do it. Then, as now, there was a feeling that anti Semitism was only an issue that applied to Jews. When the novelist Émile Zola, and if we go to the next slide, published his incendiary article, J'accuse, I Accuse, in January 1898, which blew the lid off the case by exposing how the army's top brass, including Mercier, the Minister of War, had attempted to frame Dreyfus, he barely mentioned the issue of anti Semitism. But the publication of Zola's article set off a series of anti Semitic riots that lasted for months. Over 69 French cities and towns, many with no Jews, witnessed anti Semitic agitation in the spring of 1898. The most violent demonstrations occurred in colonial Algeria, where Jews were beaten and even killed by non Jewish Europeans. By this point, France was divided between Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. And in the book, I try to understand what was at stake for each group. At first, many of those who opposed Dreyfus did so because they genuinely believed he was guilty. But after the revelation that the bordereau was the work not of Dreyfus, but of a dissolute minor nobleman named Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy, and if we go to the next slide, whose crime, that's J'accuse. Okay, there is Esterhazy, whose crime the army had attempted to cover up. A disturbingly large percentage of the country remained dedicated to opposing justice for Dreyfus. So some felt that the honor of the army was more important than justice for the individual. Others merely hated Jews and thought they deserved to be punished, regardless of whether Dreyfus himself, this particular Jew, was actually guilty. They were fed by increasingly disturbing anti-Semitic propaganda, including the series of posters known as the Museum of Horrors, if we go to the next slide, which caricatured leading Dreyfusards and other animals. Yeah, those two. We can go to the next one. As animals. So here we have Dreyfus's face on the body of a serpent. The other slide was Dreyfus being lynched. Their dehumanization of the Jewish enemy rivals anything that was seen during the Nazi period. The next major break in the case came when it was revealed that much of the evidence against Dreyfus had actually been forged, and when the forger, Commandant Hubert Joseph Henri, slit his own throat in prison. Finally possessing the definitive proof they needed that Dreyfus had been framed, his family filed a petition to overturn the verdict. Drummond, meanwhile, took up a collection for the forger Henri's widow in the pages of La Libre Parole. Thousands of people contributed to the fund, often attaching violently anti Semitic messages to their donations. Long live the saber that will rid us of all the vermin. A patriot awaiting the saber to avenge us. For God, for country, and the extermination of the Jews, read some of the messages. One contributor gave 25 cents to rent a deportation car. Although the scholar Stephen Wilson, one of the few to focus on the question of anti Semitism during the affair, argues that the violence expressed in the Henri donations remained purely symbolic, it seems clear to me that it unleashed the imagination of genocide, if not its actual implementation. So while half of France went down a very dark path during the affair, the good news is that the other half came to the defense of the Jewish officer. The modern use of the term intellectual to describe cultural figures who take a stand on political issues dates to this moment, as thousands of writers, teachers, and artists spoke out in favor of Dreyfus. The Dreyfusards formed the Human Rights League and other organizations to defend democratic values, which they understood were under threat. Meanwhile, on Devil's Island, Dreyfus had no idea of the campaign being waged on his behalf. Almost completely cut off from the outside world, except for a slow trickle of letters that arrived heavily censored by the authorities, the prisoner engaged in a daily struggle for survival. Watched day and night by guards who did not speak a word to him, he felt profoundly alone, abandoned. Days were spent gathering wood to cook his meals before the blazing heat drove him inside his tiny, sweltering hut, where he spent most of the time writing letters and reading a range of books, including mathematical treatises and novels by Balzac and others. He even learned English to read Shakespeare in the original. The long nights were the worst. In order to prevent his escape, the guards began chaining him to his bed so that he could not move or roll over as bugs crawled all over his body, attracted by the light that shone on his face at all times. He wrote in his journal that his desire to clear his name for the sake of his wife and his children was the only thing that kept him alive for the 5 years of torment. While some historians have seen Dreyfus as incidental to the affair that bore his name, since he was outside of France as the fight to free him took place, it was really only thanks to his extraordinary will to survive that justice eventually triumphed. The historian Vincent Duclair rightly sees Dreyfus as a model of resistance to the totalitarian regimes that would mark the 20th century, and I make a similar argument. Eventually, as evidence of his innocence emerged, the army was forced to throw out the earlier judgment against Dreyfus and to bring him back from Devil's Island for a second court-martial. While the first trial lasted only 3 days, the second one played out over the course of several weeks in August and September 1899 and was covered on the front pages of newspapers throughout the world. The American press was particularly interested in the case and was basically uniformly pro-Dreyfus, which may come as a surprise given the level of nativist, racist, and even anti-Semitic sentiment that prevailed in the U.S. at the time. In their articles about the case, leading writers like Carl Schurz and Mark Twain took pains to underscore the dangers that right-wing nationalism and anti-Semitism posed for American democracy. Stick thin, his hair turned white even though he was only 39 years old, Dreyfus did his best to respond to the hostile questions of his judges and the lawyers for the prosecution at his second trial. However, his voice had become hoarse from years of not speaking, and his reticent demeanor did not endear him to the judges or to the public. Despite his evident innocence, the military court found him guilty once again, albeit this time with extenuating circumstances. How there could be extenuating circumstances when it came to treason, the court didn't say, But the French government now realized it had to act to prevent an international outcry and possibly a boycott of the 1900 Paris World's Fair. The president of the French Republic offered Dreyfus a pardon. Although his most hardline defenders urged Dreyfus to refuse the pardon, he eventually accepted it on the condition that he could still fight to clear his name. He was reunited with his family shortly thereafter, but it took until 1906 until he was completely exonerated by French courts, reinstated in the army, and awarded the Legion of Honor. Dreyfus lived most of the rest of his life quietly, and if we go to the next slide, there he is as an old man, although his name remained a battle line in the ongoing war between right-wing nationalists and liberal universalists, a war that in many ways has never really ended in France. And in fact, the case continues to arouse passions. During the last presidential election, the right-wing candidate Eric Zemmour made headlines by claiming that Dreyfus's innocence was not obvious. Dreyfus came out of retirement to fight in World War I. His son, Pierre, also fought in every major battle of World War I, and his nephew was killed in battle. Dreyfus died in 1936, shortly after Hitler came to power. The Dreyfus family was not spared the horror of the Holocaust. Lucie Dreyfus, now an old woman, was forced to hide in a convent under an assumed name, and Dreyfus's favorite granddaughter, Madeleine, a resistance fighter, was murdered in Auschwitz. If we go to the next slide, here's a picture I took of the Dreyfus, the grave of the Dreyfus family in the Jewish section of Montparnasse Cemetery that shows Alfred at the top, and then right after Madeleine, quote, deported by the Germans, disappeared at Auschwitz at the age of 25. The final part of my book explores the effect of Dreyfus's life on the lives of Jews around the world. Of course, non-Jews were passionately interested in the case as well, but for Jews, the case became an obsession. From London to Sydney, from St. Petersburg to Cincinnati, Jewish readers devoured dispatches from Devil's Island, interviews with Dreyfus's wife, and accounts of his legal maneuvers in Jewish newspapers that often seemed to report on little else. I read the main newspapers in English and French and had research assistants help me with the Hebrew, Yiddish, and German papers. What I discovered was that the affair served as a kind of turning point or catalyst for the three major Jewish political ideologies of the time. Zionism, which called for Jews to return or to form their own nation in Palestine, what we might call integrationism, which believed Jews should be loyal citizens to the countries of their birth and stay where they are, and socialism, which called for the solidarity of the working class beyond national, religious, or ethnic borders. These ideologies were in fierce conflict at the end of the 19th century during the very years that the Dreyfus affair played out. It's striking that proponents of the three major political ideologies, the Zionists, the integrationists, and the socialists, all found in the Dreyfus affair confirmation of their vision of the Jewish future. Despite the fact that these ideologies were in many ways diametrically opposed. And this was because of the complexity of the affair and its many different phases. So the integrationists could fixate on Dreyfus's exoneration as the ultimate validation of their worldview, conveniently forgetting the anti-Semitic riots that preceded it. The Zionists could do the reverse, focusing on the outpouring of anti-Semitism, which seemed to prove that Jews could never be safe without a country of their own. And socialists could see in the affair the need for a specifically Jewish form of working class solidarity. The affair served to clarify, but also to harden their ideological positions and to draw battle lines before the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel rendered prior answers to the so-called Jewish question obsolete. It could also be argued, though, that the affair brought out not just differences, but also a fundamental similarity in the way that Jews viewed themselves and their world. And here, as I move to the conclusion of the talk, I think we start to see some of the lessons of the Dreyfus affair for our current moment. There's clearly a lot that the affair can teach us about the reasons for anti Semitism. I show in the book how anti Semitism developed in the late 19th century as a reaction to modernity and how it tended to attract those individuals or group who have been left behind by economic, social, and technological change. And I think something similar is taking place today. But I also think the Dreyfus affair reveals how Jews were able to meet the challenge of a difficult moment. There's a long tradition that blames late 19th century French Jews for failing to confront the anti Semitism unleashed during the affair. This tradition dates to the time of the affair itself, when the early Zionist leaders, including Max Nordau and Theodor Herzl, attacked the supposed passivity of French Jews as a way to drum up support for the idea of a Jewish state. This critique would be taken up by many Jewish historians after World War II, especially Hannah Arendt, for whom the supposed passivity of French Jews during the Dreyfus affair foreshadowed the flawed response of the international Jewish community to the Nazi threat. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1951, Arendt famously called the Dreyfus affair the dress rehearsal for the performance of our time. And she was especially brutal in her condemnation of French Jews, who she claimed were too concerned about their social standing to lift a finger on behalf of the unjustly condemned man. As I show in the book, the truth is more complicated. On the one hand, it is in fact true that the French Jewish consistory, the elected body that regulated Jewish religious practice in France, remained largely silent on the topic of the affair. As part of the official government bureaucracy, it couldn't criticize the military. Likewise, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a non-governmental organization that advocated for the rights of Jews abroad, saw a domestic matter like the affair as beyond its purview. On the other hand, various other non-governmental Jewish organizations, including many individual Jews, including some of the leaders of the consistory and the Alliance, defended Dreyfus and Jewish interests during the affair. And France's chief rabbi, Zadok Khan, played an especially active role. As we confront the rise of anti-Semitism today, it's important to keep this history in mind. If France weathered the storm of the Dreyfus affair, if the waves of anti-Semitic agitation eventually passed and French democratic institutions withstood the onslaught by right-wing nationalists, at least until the 1940s, it's in part because so many French Jews, including those who believed in the French model of integration, mobilized in support of Dreyfus. They did so by signing petitions, in attending trials, joining the Human Rights League, or in the case of the group of Jewish socialist workers of Paris, staging demonstrations on behalf of Dreyfus. Herzl and Nordau would complain that the French Jews at the time of the affair did not call the Republic into question, even when it seemed to turn against them as Jews. This is true. But it's also true that even as they reaffirmed their faith in the French Republic, they did so with a new understanding of what they required in exchange for their loyalty. As one editorial in the Jewish newspaper Les Archives Israélites put it in March 1898, as anti-Semitic riots were raging across France, the Republic, if it is not to betray its mission, cannot tolerate any attack on the principles of public tranquility and social fraternity, which are often contested, disputed, and abused in the form of anti-Semitism by the reactionaries and the clericals. So it was thanks to the affair that French Jews became more conscious of what it meant to be citizens of a republic and more willing to fight for their rights. So turn-of-the-century Jews may have disagreed about almost everything having to do with Jewish life, from how to worship to the need for a Jewish state. But they could come together in shared sorrow as they read about the plight of the prisoner of Devil's Island, and they could rejoice together as the vindicated Jewish officer received the Legion of Honor. I argue in my book, and I'm drawing to the conclusion here, that it was in the collective experience of the affair that a new Jewish sense of community took shape beyond national, ideological, or religious borders. Here also, the example of the Jewish reaction to the affair has important lessons for us today. So just one little coda here. Like many of you, I've spent the last 7 months watching the horror unfold in the Middle East. I've been dismayed by the reaction by many in the Jewish community on both sides of this debate who have too often focused on attacking other Jews rather than on confronting the anti-Semitism that is growing by the day around the world and also in the United States. I understand it's much easier to express anger at people close to you than to acknowledge your powerlessness to affect change on a global scale. But now more than ever, in the face of the threats from militants like Hamas and from anti-Semites on our own shores, we all, Jews and non-Jews, need to come together. This doesn't mean everyone has to agree about Israel. There's room for robust debate about the Middle East and other political issues. But it does mean looking at the current situation with a clear eye. The affair showed how Jews and their allies could put aside political differences to combat the threat of anti-Semitism. It's now time to learn from that example. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, definitely amazing how many parallels we can draw from the history. We got plenty of questions. Let's start with one from Deborah Glazer. I read Dreyfus's diary, and nowhere did I see that he mentioned that he was being discriminated against because he was Jewish. Was he, in fact, aware of this dimension of why he was accused?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing. So his diary, which was published, and it's really worth reading, it's called 5 Years of My Life in English, and it became an international bestseller, makes no reference to anti-Semitism and no reference to Jewish identity at all. Yeah, why is that? Well, it's clear that he knew that everything he was reading was going to be scrutinized by the authorities. And so he, even in his letters with his wife, which were also published, he makes no reference to that. I think two things. First of all, he did express the knowledge that, so I quoted in the talk that he supposedly, but it's pretty certain this happened, said to his jailer, my only crime is being born a Jew. His sister said something similar. So that's proof. Then at the end, his final trial that exonerated him in 1906, the lawyers went into great detail to say that that anti-Semitism was behind the case, and there's no way they would have done that without his approving it. So it's clear that he did understand that, and his son, I should also say, his son, after Dreyfus's death, his son published some other of his writings and says in the introduction that he understood how central anti-Semitism was. I think that he didn't put it in his diary, partly because he was an incredibly dignified person. And I think he didn't want to dignify anti-Semitism by referring to it. He was extremely private about his Jewish identity. And I think that he thought that was something that he shouldn't, discuss openly.
And the family maintained that desire for privacy around Jewish identity after the affair?
Yes, it's interesting. I just was in France and met with some descendants of Dreyfus, including his grandson, who's 97 years old and who's probably the last person who knew him. Totally still sharp, had read my book. And he confirmed a lot of what I say in the book about that they were, proud Jews. They associated with other Jews. If anything, their Jewish identity became more important in the next generation where, they were marked by the experience of World War II and having to flee. So Dreyfus's son's family, including the 97-year-old, fled to New York during the war. His daughter and her family stayed in France, went into hiding. So, yeah.
Here's one from Mark Neugebauer. Does Professor Samuels know of other situations like that of Dreyfus in other countries during the 19th century, i.e., other Jewish scapegoats in other nations in Europe at the time?
Yeah, there are various famous cases around the time, and there's a book by someone, I think his name is Lindemann, called "The Jew Accused." He focuses on a few different cases, including Dreyfus. I think he focuses on the Bayless case, which was happened in the Russian Empire, and then of course there's Leo Frank in America, not that long after, in the early decades of the 20th century.
Deborah Glazer asks, was Devil's Island used for other prisoners, so was it chosen specifically for him?
Yeah, so it was part of a prison colony on the Salvation Islands. There were a few different prisons. The main prison was on a different island. And if you've ever seen the Steve McQueen movie Papillon, it takes place in a later period, I think in the 1930s, on that bigger island. Devil's Island had been used as a leper colony. They decided they wanted to put Dreyfus there because it was seen as totally escape proof. It was surrounded by shark infested waters. It was really hard to get on or off. So they quickly got rid of the lepers, and then Dreyfus was the only prisoner on it.
I think, was it that you quoted someone calling it the dry guillotine?
Yeah, Victor Hugo called that whole prison colony the dry guillotine because, while they had outlawed capital punishment for political crimes in France, so many people died in these prison colonies that, I mean, they were really, really brutal places.
Andrew Bellamet asks, Emile Zola's involvement is well known. Any information on where Jules Verne and Alexander Dumas stood?
Yeah. So unfortunately, Jules Verne was an anti-Dreyfusard. I was sorry to learn. So he was on the right. And then Dumas, fils, I forget, actually, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So in the book, I look at a bunch of people. I mean, other famous writers, Marcel Proust, whose mother was Jewish, was pro-Dreyfus. The affair split the Impressionists. Pissarro, who was Jewish, was pro-Dreyfus. So was Monet. But Degas, for instance, was anti-Dreyfus.
And their opinions on Dreyfus just reflected their other political opinions.
Yeah, largely it kind of lined up with those on the more left-leaning were pro-Dreyfus and more right-leaning were anti. But sometimes it's hard to say. And it's clear that Degas was an anti-Semite, so.
Another question on Zola. Stephen Fogelson asked, can you comment on how significant a role Zola played in exonerating Dreyfus?
Yeah, he played a big role. So there had been other intellectuals signing petitions, but Zola was a household name. He was one of the most popular and successful novelists in France at the time. And J'accuse really blew the lid off the case. And he did, this is getting a little in the weeds, I explained it in the book, but he had a very specific gambit there. So because Dreyfus's trial had been a court-martial, they did not have to reveal the evidence. It was all behind closed doors. They didn't have to reveal the evidence to the public, but they didn't even reveal it to Dreyfus's lawyers, which was not even, legitimate even in a military court-martial. Dreyfus wanted to expose how flimsy the evidence was. So he accused the army he just went through, officer by officer, accused them of orchestrating framing Dreyfus and then covering up the crime of the real traitor Esterhazy, knowing that that would force them to sue him for libel, which they did, and that would be in civil court, and then the evidence would have to come out, and that basically worked. Although Zola was found guilty of libel and had to flee the country, he flees to England. And then he eventually comes back, after the Dreyfus affair, and he dies in 1902 under mysterious circumstances. His chimney is stopped up and people speculate that he was murdered by an anti-Dreyfusard. But that the publication of J'accuse made people really aware of that. That's what like really began the process to free Dreyfus.
And follow up to that, Jake Goldberg asks, what happened to Esterhazy?
Esterhazy, who's like he's like a cartoon villain. He even looks like a villain. I think he has this like, bizarre walrus mustache and these beady eyes, and he was just a horrible guy. He was, Dreyfus was the least likely person to commit treason. He had, in addition to being an ardent patriot, he had a large personal family fortune. He had no reason to, no motive. Whereas Esterhazy was this dissolute gambler who owed money all over the place, would loudly proclaim he hated France. I mean, he was just a horrible guy. He basically gets away with it. So the army covers it up. And then he has a court martial when the evidence comes out. He has a court martial. He's found innocent by the court martial. It's just completely outrageous, even though his handwriting totally, was corresponded. And so he flees also to England, lives out his days in England. He'll occasionally through the years will like sell his story to a newspaper for money. And yeah.
Okay, we got time for a couple more. Andrew Taylor asks about the place of Jews in French society. Could Jews go into any type of work in France at that time, in the late 1800s, or were they barred from certain work?
This is an important point. This is one of the things that makes France like pretty unique. So France is the first European country to give full civil rights to the Jews in 1790 and 91 during the French Revolution. After that point, there are no legal obstacles to full Jewish integration. So they can hold any position, they can attend any school. Entrance to the top universities is meritocratic. They attend in huge numbers. They hold public office. So unlike in England, where they can't sit in parliament without pledging on the Christian Bible until the 1850s, nothing like that in France. It's really not until 1870 that Jews get full civil rights in Germany. And even in the United States, people don't realize that Jews have full equality at the federal level, but there are restrictions barring Jewish office holding in certain states until late in the 19th century. And of course, Jews are excluded from many universities, including my own, until the 1960s. There were quotas. So nothing like that in France. Jews have full equality.
Okay, let's finish up. We have one from Jerry Alperstein. What was Dreyfus's service in World War I? And I guess got to add to that, did he discuss his motivations for rejoining the army at that time after having
he was an incredible patriot. I should say this is kind of interesting too, why he retires from the army. So he gets he's completely exonerated in 1906. There's another ceremony giving him the Legion of Honor in the same place in the École Militaire. But they promote him, I think it's to, I could be getting wrong, to lieutenant colonel then or major then. I think he's promoted to major, but they don't give him the rank that he should have had if they had counted the 5 years on Devil's Island. And he protests, and they say, no, sorry. So everyone who entered officer training school in his year is above him, even though he had this like horrible injustice. So dignified guy that he is, he retires from the military, but then he comes out of retirement in World War I, and he does see duty. I don't think it's not like he's pretty old at that point. He's in his late 50s. But he does, I think, on the outskirts of Paris, does see not exactly combat, but he is, he is actively serving, and then his son is, in the trenches in like all the major battles of World War One.
Did the son just serve during the war, or did he have a career in the military?
No, he just served during the war, but for several years. And then he unfortunately then had to flee France during World War II, and then died in a plane crash in 1947. So that's the father of the guy who I met, who's 97 now.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for doing this, Maury. Do you got any last words you want to share with everybody? Any final
No, thank
thoughts?
you all for coming. Thanks for the great questions. A lot of those questions are answered in the book, so in much more detail. So
Yeah, and we will send a follow-up email to everyone who register with links to purchase the book and the recording of this talk. So thank you so much for everyone being on, and we will hopefully catch everyone for the next one. Thank you.
all right, thank you so much.